Thank you, John. We read Isaiah 50 in part because God there makes a clear statement to his people, to his children, that he will not and he cannot forget them. He will not forget them. He cannot forget them. That's from Isaiah 49. With that in mind, please turn to Psalm chapter 13. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long will my enemies be exalted over me? Consider and hear me, O Lord my God, enlighten my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest my enemies say, I have prevailed against him, lest those who trouble me rejoice when I am moved. But I have trusted in your mercy. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Psalm chapter 13. I must admit at the outset that I wasn't thrilled to see Psalm 13 coming right along. Not my favorite in the whole world. Love Psalm 1, Law of God, easy to preach from. Love Psalm 2, the kingdom of Christ. Love to talk about that. Could talk all year about that. This kind of psalm here, though, a little bit different. But Psalm 13, we're preaching through the Psalms, and from grade school I recall that Psalm 13 comes after Psalm 12. It's next in line. So I did as I normally do. Some of you know that one of the ways that I prep for sermons is I listen to sermons on sermon audio. I travel about an hour each way to work. It gives me time to make my phone calls and also to study, if you will. Nowadays, with all the electronic gadgets we have, we can listen to sermons, which is a wonderful thing for me. It's just terrific. I'm so grateful for sermon audio and other options as well. I'm just so grateful for it. So I always, when I see a psalm, I look at the various titles and sort of kind of pick from the title of the psalm and sort of kind of pick from maybe the pastor who's preaching it, because after a while you get some favorites that you want to listen to. And that was not real encouraging. I wasn't any more excited to preach this sermon after looking at the titles than I was before. Titles like, here's one. Intro to, spiritual depression, number 1, the basics. That sounds fun. The basics of spiritual depression. Overcoming depression and suicidal thoughts. David's darkest hour, when David felt abandoned by God. Dealing with depression. Steps for dealing with dark days. Dealing with dark days. Not really me. You see, part of my difficulty is I'm not that emotional of a guy in some ways. We all know emotional people. They're the ones that like hugs and like to talk on an emotional level. I'm not that way very much. I'm more cerebral. We all know people that like hugs and like to hug. Not a hugger. Me, right here. Not a hugger. I don't feel any closer singing "Blessed be the tie that binds holding hands" than if I'm not holding hands. I'd rather not hold hands. There's one person I'd like to hug. I love hugging Mrs. Saint. I enjoy that. I look forward to hugging Mrs. Saint. I like it. Everyone else, not so much. I don't care who you are. It's not what I like doing. I'm not emotional that way. So you come to a psalm like this, and it's just a little bit different. But let's talk about something else too. Let's talk about Well, here's what I thought of to introduce this. We all know when we see our politicians stand up that they have something called handlers, right? They have PR firms that tell them everything. And the further they go up, excuse me, the further they go up in stature, the more they have handlers that handle them. And the handlers cover all the basics. The handlers tell them what to wear. The handlers schedule, this, go see this group, don't go see that group. Hey, if you're going to talk to these people, you better say this, don't mention that. In other words, the handlers pretty much tell them who they are. The handlers tell them what to leave exposed and what to keep covered up. Now, with this particular psalm, I would think that if there was ever a psalm for the handlers to leave on the cutting room floor, it would be this one, right here. Because this psalm destroys our modern idea of the vending machine God that we are all coming to be exposed to. You know, that God, you just flip off a prayer and he just can't wait. He's like sitting up in heaven with his hands at the controls, just waiting for us to do the quick prayer so he can fix all our problems. Psalm 13 presents a different God from that. This is the psalm to leave out of the Bible if you're just going to be the Pollyanna-ish God who just sits around waiting to solve everything. You notice that God never does act in this psalm. 6 verses, God acts not at all. You see, what we want to see here this morning is that David, in a sense, held the key to his own despair. Now, I'm staying away from the word depression here. Depression is a word that's used an awful lot. Instead of using the word despair, depression has got to be kind of like a medical term, if you will. And I don't exactly know what it actually means exactly. I have read crazy numbers, like over 60 million Americans, which seems crazy to me. I can hardly believe it. Over 60 million Americans on various mind influencing drugs. 60 million? I don't know who's prescribing it. I don't really know what's going on. I have no idea. But I do know that this man after God's own heart experienced deep despair. Our outline goes like this. Verses 1 through 3, despair. Verse 4, the end of verse 3 and verse 4, description. He describes his situation to God. In verses 5 and 6, deliverance. So we have despair, description, and deliverance. A few things I want you to notice at the beginning. I think, well, at the very beginning, he says to the chief musician. Now, not only do we not leave this psalm on the cutting room floor, not only do we include it, but David wants to make sure that we sing this psalm just as we just did, as Isaac Watts rewrote it for us, and we sang it. Did you know that the singing of this psalm that we just did is prescribed by God through David right here in the heading, to the chief musician? Not to just any musician. Get the chief. Make sure this thing gets sung. This is presenting a real life situation that we don't want to talk about, and that in a lot of our modern books and a lot of our modern ideas about God, we don't even believe. Because we constantly present a God who's just like instant everything. And that's not what the psalm presents. Not only does it go to the chief musician, I believe that it was written, and we're going to address this a little bit later on this morning, but I believe this was written at the beginning of his time. It's discussed. Some people think it was written when he was running away from Absalom. I actually happen to believe that most of these psalms, especially at the beginning, were written during his times with Saul when things were very difficult. And I'll tell you why I say that. Look here at verse 2. How long will my enemy, there in verse 2, at the end of verse 2, be exalted over me? And then verse 4, lest my enemy say. And so we see a singular enemy, but in the end of verse 4, let those who trouble me rejoice when I am moved. Oftentimes David talks about enemies. In this case, he talks about a singular enemy. And to me that makes sense, singular enemy being Saul, but those who troubled him were those who supported Saul. And we know from 1 Samuel that one of the ways that Saul became so powerful was well, here's a novel idea. You've probably never heard of this. But Saul gained power over his subjects by expropriating, stealing their land and their money. You can do that when you're king and you have soldiers. Took their land and their money, and then used their land and their money to pay off some people who could further oppress them. I don't know if you've ever heard of anything like that or not happening, but that's what Saul successfully did. So David had people that were troubling him. In fact, it's not real well known, but David's first original band of supporters in the wilderness of En-Gedi was basically a tax rebellion. It was people who could no longer pay their taxes got kicked off their land. So David had an awful lot of people who were against him, and I believe at this time. Well, let's look through the passage here, and we want to see the desperate condition that David was in, the despairing condition, and we're going to see how it ended. Notice first of all what David did not do. David does not blame God for his circumstance. He doesn't say anything like, you know what, if you were really sovereign, I love the idea of sovereignty. We studied it in Sunday school. I read the Westminster Confession, and I believe that God's sovereign. However, that's just for my Sunday school lesson. Fact is, in this situation, you're clearly not sovereign, because if you were sovereign, I wouldn't be in this bad situation. He doesn't say that. He never questions God's sovereignty here. Secondly, what he doesn't do, he doesn't take his complaint to everybody else. Now this is very interesting to me. You could easily read through the Psalms, and you could conclude David the whiner. If you don't believe me, go to some of his Psalms. He sounds like he's got a complaint. But his complaint is not to his neighbors. It's to God. Now we want to be really clear on this. God, nowhere that I know of, turns down David for complaining. Now in the case of some of his servants, his answers can be pretty stiff medicine. That happened in the life of the prophet Jeremiah. That happened in the life of the disciples. We don't have time to turn to it, but in Luke 16, the disciples asked God, or Christ directly, say, we want to increase our faith. The answer wasn't too exciting. Christ gave him a story of a man who goes out as a servant. And he goes out and he does his job. And he comes back in, his master says, you know what? I'm hungry. Feed me. And then you can get something to eat. And Christ was saying, look, you really want to serve me? You want to be increased in faith? Get out there and do your job, and don't expect to be patted on the back every single minute for just doing your job. Big time lesson there for us men especially, for all of us, but men especially. When it comes to our families, when it comes to our wives, when it comes to our children, do your job, even if you aren't getting patted on the back all the time for that. Luke 16 is a pretty tough passage. But God never says, don't complain to me. But he says, definitely, you're going to pay attention to the answer that I give you. David does not even get an answer in this one. 4 times he says, how long? Or, you could even read this, how much longer? You see, the psalm wasn't written on the first day that he had a problem. These problems kept on building and building and building. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? Is there a more direct picture, my friends? Please, I hope you come back to, I hope you have opportunities, not too many, but if you get into a situation where you feel like God has left you, where you feel like you're lost and it's dark and you can't see the face of God and He doesn't hear your prayers, I hope you remember Psalm 13. It's easy to remember. It's 13. You know that number that we all have problems with, right? That the poor guy that I read about a while ago was doing a bungee jump out of a hotel, and things didn't go well. He forgot that most hotels don't have a 13th floor, so he hit the ground hard because he counted the floors, right? Did all his math, but most hotels don't have a 13th floor. They go from 12 right to 14, so he's missing 12 feet and landed pretty hard at the bottom. Didn't get killed, but should have taken that into consideration. So 13, remember please the 13th Psalm, and please remember these first few verses. It is a picture of the deepest, blackest despair that you can think of. And it's not written in quick frustration. It's written over time. Please remember that. How long, how long, how long, and how long. He says 4 times. Will you forget me forever? Yes, I'm sure David knew theologically that God doesn't forget him. But he can't see the hand of God in his life. And I want to spend some time here. How long will you hide your face from me? What does that mean, God hiding His face from him? Well, there's a couple passages we want to look at. First of all, let's look at Numbers chapter 6. I think this is what David has in mind here. This is a benediction that Aaron prayed for the children of Israel, for those who knew God. The Lord bless you, Numbers chapter 6 and verse 23. Let's start there. Speak to Aaron and his son, saying, this is the way you shall bless the children of Israel. Say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. And what Moses is doing here is he's connecting the face of God, the countenance of God, for God's grace and God's peace. Now, it's not that hard to figure out what's happening here. If we don't have the favor of God on our lives, my friends, we're going to have trouble having His peace, and we're going to have trouble experiencing His grace. The Lord make His face shine upon you, be gracious to you, lift up His countenance upon you, give you peace. And David is certainly writing Psalm 13 from a position of not having peace and wondering about God's grace. Well, how does this work practically? Well, let's just take a couple of quick examples. Turn with me, if you would, to Job chapter 29. Job is going to talk about what it's like when he has God's face, when he has God's countenance favoring him. He's going to lay it out. Job chapter 29. Job is winning the argument here against his initial 3 friends. He is talking about the fact that he hasn't done anything to deserve the hand of God that is coming down heavy on him. Eli, who has not yet stepped in, and of course God has not yet questioned him. Job chapter 29, Job further continued his discourse and said, oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God watched over me, when His lamp shone upon my head, when by His light I walked through darkness, just as I was in the days of my prime, when the friendly counsel of God was over my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were around me, when my steps were bathed with cream, and the rock poured out rivers of oil for me. You see, he uses some verbs here, some terms of how God was blessing him. He says, God watched over me. His lamp shone over my head. By His light I walked through darkness. When the friendly counsel, verse 4, of God was over my tent. This is a description, Job says, of when God was gracious to me. And look at one of the first, this has to do with what we talked about this morning. Look at one of the first blessings that he mentions. when my children were around me. Job is saying what a blessing it was to have his children around him. Nowadays, it's a blessing to have our children not around us. Such a blessing to have them grow up and move out of the house, or sent off to the babysitters, or be raised by someone else, so we can get back to living. Job says, when God was blessing me, my children were around me. What a wonderful thing. Look at Daniel chapter 9, if you would. Daniel's praying. It's at the end of the 70 years. And he realizes that it's time to go back home. Daniel chapter 9 too. He realizes, he says, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, talking about Darius, he says, in the first year of his reign, Daniel understood by the books the number of the years specified by the word of the Lord through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. Chapter 9 and verse 2. Well, how does this idea of God's face, God's favor, fit in here? Well, Daniel prays a long prayer of repentance. He talks about how they've turned their back on God, and God threw them out of the land just like he said he would. He even mentions Moses. Verse 13, as it is written in the law of Moses, all this disaster, this is Daniel 9:13, has come upon us. Yet we have not made our prayer before the Lord our God, that we might turn from our iniquities and understand your truth. He's saying nothing's happened to us except what was already told us by Moses a long time ago. No surprises here. But then he asks for this. He says in verse 16, O Lord, according to your righteousness I pray, let your anger and your fury be turned away from your city Jerusalem, your holy mountain, because for our sins and for the iniquities of our fathers, Jerusalem, your people, are a reproach to all those around us. And here he prays it. Now therefore, our God, hear the prayer of your servant and his supplications, and for the Lord's sake, cause your face to shine on your sanctuary, which is desolate. You know, I hope, my friends, I hope you can look back to times in your life when you felt the gracious face, the gracious countenance of our wonderful God on your life. It's just, and we know that David felt that, and we know that David experienced that. But Psalm 13 is telling us very clearly that it's not all the time. It's not every day. But certainly I hope we all pray for God's gracious countenance and his gracious face to be on us. And I think that's what David's missing here in Psalm 13. How long will you hide your gracious face from me? I don't see it. Verse 2, how long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? There's a lot about this whole depression, despairing thing that I don't know, but one thing I do know is that when you're in this state of mind, the counsel that you take in your soul usually doesn't make a whole lot of sense because you're always changing it. How do I get out of this? What do I have to do to fix this? And one plan comes up. No, that's not going to work. Then another plan. Now that's not going to work either. Plan C. Well, no, maybe I need a combination of plan A and plan C. And David is saying, I've been thinking about this. I've been taking counsel in my soul. You know what? None of it's working. That's why I'm coming to you, because I can't get out of this. And where are you? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? It is legit. It is legit to be concerned about your enemies. And we all have them. It's just that when it comes to David, David's a little bit different because David appears to have dealt fairly graciously with at least some of his enemies. But he had a different view towards the enemies of God, and he prayed on more than one occasion that God's enemies would be his enemies. And he doesn't want God's enemies here, or his enemies, to be exalted because of his problems. Have you ever prayed that? I mean, this is an interesting passage here. I don't know if I've ever in my life, I thought about this as I was preparing. I don't think I've ever prayed that prayer right there. Some of the others I have. But prayed that God would hear my prayer, lest my enemy be exalted over me. In verse 4, lest my enemy say I prevail against him. I have to ask myself, is there a good reason why I don't have enemies like David had enemies? Is it a good thing if I just get along with everybody? And nobody has a problem with Joel. Hey, it's a great guy. David was a man, a godly man, and he sure had his enemies, did he not? I don't know if I've ever prayed that. Enlighten my eyes. I like that in verse 3. Consider and hear me, O Lord my God, enlighten my eyes. You know what David's saying there? He said, I'm blind. Truly, he's saying, if I, O Lord, do not have your counsel, if I do not have your direction, I'm blind. I can't see a single thing. Do you and I really believe that? Do we really believe that if we don't have the counsel of God through His Word that we're really blind? Or do we believe that there's a section, okay, here's darkness, here's God's light, but there's a section in the middle where we can figure it out without God? I hope we don't believe that, because all of God's grace, all of His mercy, all of His wisdom comes from Him. And without that we have nothing. We don't have a single thing at all. And David he is laying it out. You have to love David for this. Dear God, if I don't have you, blind. Now, let's consider who we're talking about here. Nowadays, especially for young men, you have to make a choice. Along about maybe age 8, 9, or 10. Are you going to be an athlete or are you going to be a musician? That's not quite like that all the time, but it sort of happens that way. David is a man who didn't have to make that choice. You ever think about that? David was an athlete. He was a serious athlete. When you run, not walk, when it's time to fight Goliath, and you run towards Goliath, you're in some kind of shape. Pretty good shape. And we can whip that stone as straight as he could. I'd say you're pretty coordinated. I'd say that. I don't think David ever doubted that he was going to miss. It seems like he had that kind of confidence. So he was an athlete. He was a musician. And as a young man, he organized those men in the wilderness of En-Gedi. So he had tremendous leadership capabilities. I would say David possessed abilities all in one person beyond probably anyone I know. And David is saying, if you don't enlighten my eyes, I'm blind. He says, unless I sleep the sleep of death, I might as well be dead. That's what he's saying here. If you don't help me out, I might as well not even be living. And David was a man, don't forget this, of tremendous ability. Certainly more ability than I would have even if I lived to be 1,000. Lest those who trouble me rejoice when I am moved. So that's his description then. He's describing, God, if you don't help me here, it's like I'll be blind, it's like I'll be dead, and it's like there'll be nothing left but my enemies if you don't act. And that's his last statement here. Lest those who trouble me rejoice when I am moved. I will admit, as your pastor, that that really gives me a little bit of trouble there, verse 4. Lest those who trouble me rejoice when I am moved. I look at that and say, why should God care? But David knew that God did care. I have to think that I don't know enough about this kind of a thing. It might be because I don't have enough enemies. Now, I'm not going to go out and just get enemies just for enemies' sake. Anybody can do that. I'm not going to do that. But David was a man after God's own heart, and David was a man who talks about enemies a lot in the Bible. And it makes me wonder a little bit why I don't have more. We have despair, we have the description, then we have the deliverance. There's going to be deliverance here. Verses 5 and 6. Please notice that God does not act. The actor here is not God. Look who the actor is. It's David. Look at this. But I have trusted in your mercy. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Now, there's attitudes here that change, but there's one action that David introduces into this. One action only that I can see. His answer is in an act. We see it in verse 6. I will sing. See, the other things that he does, I have trusted in your mercy, that's attitude. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation, attitude there. But the action is he will sing. Now, wait a minute. Are you saying, Pastor, that singing is an antidote to despair? Yes. Let's not miss that point. Yes, and yes, and yes. Singing caused David, I believe, to do three things. Three things. Reflect on God's mercy, reflect on God's salvation, and remember God's bountiful providence. One of the things that singing does is it forces us to consider a thought and to finish it to its conclusion. Did you ever notice that? Often you start singing a verse of a song. What do you do when you start singing a verse of a song? You finish it. And it forces you, singing forces you to finish the thought. That's why I think that David asks, or commands, if you will, for this psalm to be put to music. Because this psalm has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. This psalm does not make sense without the last two verses. I will sing to the Lord. Now I want to talk about the singing thing a little bit. We are a culture immersed in music. But most of our music is not sung. It's heard. I mean, we have, I get a kick out of Facebook. Every once in a while I look at somebody's page. Facebook stalker, right here. I'm one of them, sometimes. I don't have time for it most of the time. But one of the things that just intrigues me is, I'll look at the music these people like, and I'll tell you most of the time, person after I've never even heard the artist. I don't know who they are. Now, I heard recently that it's possible that our teenagers today may be listening to more music than they are watching TV. I don't know which is worse, the TV or the music, or whatever. I don't even know. But we live in a time, and this is what I want to get to, and I can't really quantify the whole thing. We live in a time when we experience music, we listen to music, but it almost seems like the more listening we do, the less actual singing we do. And do you realize that the psalms that were created or written in the Bible, starting all the way back with a song or psalm, mostly a song of Moses, back in Deuteronomy, they were not meant to be listened to as such. They were meant to be participated in. They were meant to be sung. And this is a crisis I believe that we have. A crisis of a lack of singing. Because listening to the music, the nondescript music sometimes is nondescript. We're going to forget it as soon as we hear it. How many praise and worship songs have I heard where I listened to the music, the words all sounded the same to me, and the worst thing was not remembering the music, or the worst thing was not forgetting the music, the worst thing was remembering it. It was such a terrible tune, and then I couldn't get it out of my head. No. The Psalms, like I say, I can't quantify this like I'd like to, but I do know that David talks about singing, and all throughout the Bible, singing to yourselves, and psalms, hymns, spiritual songs in the New Testament. Music was definitely meant to be participatory, not so much observational or spectator. Music is about participation in the Bible. It's not a spectator sport. There's a lot more that could be said about that, but David doesn't even say, well, I'm gonna go crank up my CD, or that shows how old I am. I was about to say 8-track tape player, just kidding. I guess it's electronic. What do? You plug it in or something, however, way EMP or DMP or something like that. It's electronic, and you plug stuff in and push buttons, and you hear stuff, music. He's not saying that. He's saying, I myself, I'm going to participate here. Now, I don't know if this has ever happened to you. It has happened to me, where I was, I can think of a case right now. I don't really want to share the details. It was a case in my home where I was just desperate. I just did not know what to do. It seemed like everything was against me. And someone encouraged me to sing. And I got to tell you, I sang through, and I don't remember what song it was. I sang through the entire song. And I have to tell you, my attitude after this, and I remember it very distinctly. I remember where I was sitting. I wish I could remember the song. But I do remember this, that the despair that I had just been experiencing was just gone. And one of the nice things about that song was, I remember thinking this, you know what? After I said, you know what, God, He is sovereign. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. See, I was thinking about God's providence here, which is what David's talking about, because He has dealt bountifully with me. And I remember thinking about that. Hasn't God, I remember it, hasn't God dealt well with me? Hasn't He been good to me and my family all these years? Am I forgetting that? And singing brought God's providence back to my remembrance. And so our study this morning, to wrap up, has to do with this application that I hope you remember. That when you get to this blackness, this despairing time that David experienced, and don't think it can never happen. If it can happen to David, it can happen to you and I. But there is an answer. There is something you can do, and you can do what David did. You can sing. And you can reflect on God's mercy that He's already shown on your behalf in sending His Son. On His salvation, which He's already given you on behalf of His Son. And on His providence for giving you life, for giving you family, for giving you food, for giving you a roof. That's what singing does. If you get to this point, David says there's an answer. Even if God doesn't act. And God didn't act here. God didn't change a single thing. David was the one that changed. David sang. David reflected on God's mercy, His salvation, and His providence. Shall we pray? Oh Lord God, thank You for Your servant. Thank You for including this psalm, which quite frankly I would have just been happy just to skip or not even preach on. Oh Lord God, we cannot ever reject or skip over or ignore Your word. It's here for a reason. It's here for our benefit. And it's here for us to reflect on Your goodness and Your mercy and Your kindness. We ask, O Lord, that we would forever and ever reflect on Your mercy, Your salvation, and Your providence. And should You bring us to these desperate place, or this desperate place, may we remember Psalm 13 and the benefit that it is to all of us. For it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.